Chapter 7. It was about 6 o'clock when the car from the police judiciaire stopped on Avenue Carnot, outside the building where the Gouins lived, but at the pavement opposite, the front of it pointing towards the Terme neighbourhood. Night had fallen early. That day there'd not been any more sunshine than the 3 previous days. The lights were on in the concierge's lodge. They were also on at the Gouins on the 4th floor, in the left-hand part of the apartment. Here and there, other windows were lit. Some apartments were temporarily unoccupied. The Autremons, for example, Belgians who were in high finance, were in Egypt for the winter. The Count of Tavera and his family, who lived on the 2nd floor, spent the hunting season in their chateau, somewhere to the south of the Loire. Wedged into the back of the car, wrapped in his overcoat with his pipe sticking out from his turned-up collar, Maigret did not move. He appeared to be in such a bad mood that after a few minutes the driver had taken a newspaper from his pocket and murmured, "Do you mind?" It was a wonder he could read without any more light than the reflected glow of a street lamp. Maigret had had the same air all afternoon. It wasn't a bad mood, strictly speaking. His colleagues knew that, but the effect was the same, and the word had been passed around Quai des Orfèvres not to disturb him. He had hardly left his office, except to emerge 2 or 3 times into the inspector's room, where he looked at them with big eyes, as if he'd forgotten what he'd come in for. He had dealt with some long-pending files, with as much ardour as if they'd suddenly become really urgent. At about 4:30, he had made his first call to the American hospital in Neuilly. "Is Professor Gouin operating at the moment?" "Yes, he'll be at least another hour. Who shall I say called?" He had hung up, reread the report that Janvier had drawn up on the tenants of the building, and the answers he had been given. Nobody had heard the gunshot. On the same floor as Louise Fillon, on the left-hand side, lived a certain Madame Mététal, a widow, still young, who had been at the theatre on Monday evening. On the floor below, the Crémieux had given a dinner party for 10 people, which by the time it ended had been really boisterous. Maigret had worked on another case and made a few unimportant phone calls. At 5:30, when he had called Neuilly again, he'd been told that the operation had just ended and that the professor was getting dressed. That was when he had taken the car. There were few other people passing on the pavements of Avenue Carnot and not many cars on the street. Over the driver's shoulder, he could read a headline on the front page of the newspaper, "Pierrot, the musician, released." It was he who had informed the reporters in accordance with his promise. The clock on the dashboard, which let out a faint light, showed 6:20. If there'd been a bistro closer, he would have had a drink, and he was sorry now that he'd not stopped on the way. It was not until 6:50 that a taxi stopped outside the building. Etienne Gouin was the first to get out and stand motionless on the pavement for a moment, while his assistant emerged in her turn from the car. He was near a street lamp, and his figure stood out against the light. He must have been half a head taller than Maigret, and was almost as broad-shouldered. It was hard to judge his build because of his loose overcoat, which seemed too big for him, and much longer than was the fashion that year. He couldn't have been unduly bothered about his appearance, and his hat was placed just anyhow on his head. Standing there, he gave the impression of a fat man who had got thinner and retained only a strong frame. He was waiting without any impatience, staring absently at a point in space, while the young woman took money from her bag to pay the driver. Then, as the taxi drove off, he stood listening to what she was telling him. She was presumably reminding him of his appointments the following day before she left. She walked with him as far as the entrance, where she handed him the dark leather briefcase she'd been holding in her hand, and watched him enter the lift before setting off in the direction of the town. "Follow her." "Right, Chief." The car only had to glide down the sloping avenue. Lucille Decaux was walking quickly, without turning. She was short, brown-haired, and as far as could be judged, plump. She turned the corner into Rue des Acacias and went straight into a pork butcher's, then into the bakery next door, and finally, after about 100 metres, into a dilapidated-looking building. Maigret sat in the car for about 10 more minutes. Then he went into the building in his turn and spoke to the concierge, whose lodge was of a different class from the one on Avenue Carnot, cluttered with an adult's bed and a child's cot. "Mademoiselle Decaux?" "4th floor on the right. She just got home." There was no lift. On the 4th floor, he rang a bell and heard steps inside. "Who's there?" a voice asked from behind the door. "Detective Chief Inspector Maigret." "One moment, please." The voice was neither surprised nor frightened. Before opening, she went to another room and took a few moments to come back. Maigret understood why when the door opened and he saw her in a dressing gown, her feet in slippers. "Come in," she said, looking at him curiously. The apartment, consisting of 3 rooms and a kitchen, was extremely clean. The wooden floor, so highly polished, you could have slid on it as if on a skating rink. He was shown into the living room, which was more like a kind of studio, with a divan covered in a striped cloth, lots of books in cases, a gramophone and shelves of records. Above the fireplace, where the young woman had just lighted some logs, was a framed photograph of Etienne Gouin. "Do you mind if I take my coat off?" "Please do. I was just making myself comfortable when you rang the bell." She wasn't pretty. Her features were irregular, her lips too thick, but she seemed to have a pleasant body. "Am I stopping you from having your dinner?" "It doesn't matter. Please sit down." She pointed to an armchair. She herself settled on the edge of the divan, pulling the hem of her dressing gown down over her bare legs. She didn't ask him any questions, merely observed him the way some people observe a famous person they at last see in the flesh. "I preferred not to disturb you at the hospital." "You would have found that difficult, because I was in the operating theatre." "Are you usually present at the professor's operations?" "Always." "How long has that been the case?" 10 years. Before that I was his student." "Are you a doctor?" "Yes." "May I ask how old you are?" "I'm 36. She was answering his questions without any hesitation, in a fairly neutral voice, but he nevertheless had the impression of a certain mistrust, perhaps a certain hostility. "I'm here to clarify a few points of detail. As I'm sure you know, in an investigation like the one I'm conducting, everything has to be checked." She was waiting for the question. "On Monday evening, unless I'm mistaken, you went to fetch your boss from Avenue Carnot just before 8. "That's right. I hailed a taxi and phoned the professor from the concierge's lodge to let him know I was waiting for him downstairs." "Is that your usual procedure?" "Yes. I only go up when there's work in the office or documents to take." "Where were you while the professor was coming down?" "By the door of the lift." "So, you know he stopped on the way down?" "He stopped for a few minutes on the 3rd floor. I assume you're aware of that." "Yes, I am." "Why haven't you asked the professor himself that question?" He preferred not to answer. "Did he behave just like the other evenings, or did he seem worried?" "Only about his patient's condition." "Did he say anything on the way to the hospital?" "He doesn't talk a lot." "You must have got to Conchin a few minutes after 8. What happened then?" "We went straight to the patient's room, along with the intern on duty." "Did you spend the whole evening there?" "No. The professor stayed in the room for about half an hour, watching out for certain reactions that didn't come. I told him he ought to get some rest." "What time was it that he went up to the 4th floor?" "I know you already asked these questions at the hospital." "Was it the head nurse of the department who told you that?" "It doesn't matter." "What time was it?" "It wasn't yet 9. "You didn't go up with him?"
I stayed with the patient. It was a child."
"I know. What time did the professor come back down?"
"I went up at about 11 to tell him that what he was expecting to happen had happened."
"Did you go into the room where he was lying down?"
"Yes."
"Was he dressed?"
"At the hospital he usually lies down fully dressed. He had simply taken off his jacket and loosened his tie."
"So, you spent all the time between 8:30 and 11 at the patient's bedside, which means it would have been possible for your boss to go back downstairs and leave the hospital without your knowing. She must have been expecting this, because he had asked the same question in Cochin, and they must have told her, and yet he saw her chest rising more rapidly. Had she prepared her answer?
"It would have been impossible, because I went upstairs at 10:15 to see if he needed anything."
Maigret, who was looking her in the eyes, said without raising his voice and with a great deal of gentleness in his tone, "You're lying, aren't you?"
"Why do you say that?"
"Because I sense that you're lying. Listen, Mademoiselle Decaux, it's easy for me to reconstruct your actions at the hospital. I can do it right now. Even if you've taught the staff well, there'll be someone who'll feel uneasy and admit the truth. You didn't go upstairs until 11.
"The professor didn't leave the hospital."
"How do you know that?"
"Because I know him better than anyone."
She pointed to the evening newspaper on a side table.
"I found that on a table in Neuilly and read it. Why did you release that young man?"
She meant Pierrot. From where he was sitting, he could read the name upside down.
"Are you so sure he didn't do it?"
"I'm not sure of anything." But you suspect the professor of killing that girl. Instead of answering her question, he asked, "Did you know her?" You forget. I'm Monsieur Gouin's assistant. I was present when he operated on her. Did you dislike her? I had no reason to dislike her. As he had his pipe in his hand, she said, "You can smoke. It doesn't bother me." Is it correct to say that the relationship between the professor and you was more intimate than purely professional? They told you that too, did they? She smiled with a certain condescension. Are you very bourgeois, Monsieur Maigret? That depends on what you mean by that. I'm trying to find out if you have fixed ideas about conventional morality. I've been in the police force for nearly 36 years, my dear. In that case, don't speak about intimate relationships. Yes, we've had an intimate relationship, our relationship as colleagues. The rest is of no importance. Does that mean there's no love between you? Certainly not in the sense you mean it. I admire Professor Gouin more than anyone else in the world. I try to help him as best I can. For 10 hours, 12 hours a day, often more, I'm at his side, and it's become such a normal thing for both of us that sometimes he doesn't even notice. We often spend the whole night together waiting for particular symptoms to manifest themselves in a patient. When he operates in the provinces or abroad, I go with him. In the street, I pay his taxi fares, and I'm the one who reminds him of his appointments, just as I'm the one who phones his wife to say that he won't be home. A long time ago, right at the beginning, things happened between us, the kind of things that normally happen between a man and a woman who find themselves in frequent contact. It didn't mean anything to him. He's done the same thing with the nurses and with many others. Didn't it mean anything to you, either? Nothing at all. She was looking him straight in the eyes, as if challenging him to contradict her. Have you ever been in love? With whom? With anyone. With a professor. Not in the way you mean it. But you've devoted your life to him. Yes. Was it he who chose you as his assistant when you qualified? It was I who put myself forward. It was something I'd been thinking about ever since I started attending his classes. You said that at the beginning certain things happened between you. Am I to understand they don't happen any more? You're an excellent father-confessor, Monsieur Maigret. They still happen every now and again. In your apartment? He's never set foot here. I don't see him climbing the 4 floors to get here. At the hospital? Sometimes. Sometimes also in his apartment. You're forgetting I'm also his secretary, and that we often spend part of the day on Avenue Carnot. Do you know his wife well? We see each other almost every day. How would you describe your relationship with her? He had the impression that a harder look came into Lucille Decaux's eyes. I'm indifferent to her, she said. Is that mutual? What is it that you want me to tell you? The truth. Let's just say that Madame Gouin looks at me the same way she looks at her servants. I suppose she has to make an effort to convince herself that she's the professor's wife. Have you met her? Once again, Maigret avoided answering. Why did your boss marry her? So as not to be alone, I suppose. That was before you became his assistant, wasn't it? Several years earlier. Does he get on well with her? He's not the kind of man who quarrels with anyone, and he has a remarkable ability to ignore people. Does he ignore his wife? He has some of his meals with her. Is that all? As far as I know. Why do you think she married him? She was just an ordinary nurse, don't forget. The professor is said to be a rich man. Is he? He earns a lot of money. He doesn't care about things like that. But he has a considerable fortune. She nodded and uncrossed her legs, not forgetting to pull down on the hem of her dressing gown. In short, in your opinion, he isn't happy in his marriage. That's not quite correct. His wife couldn't make him unhappy. What about Lulu? Nor could Lulu, that's my belief. If he wasn't in love with her, how do you explain the fact that for more than 2 years... I can't explain it. You'll have to figure it out for yourself. Someone told me she'd got under his skin. Who told you that? Isn't it true? It is and it isn't. She'd become something that belonged to him. But he wouldn't have got a divorce in order to marry her. She looked at him in astonishment. No, of course not. He would never have put himself through the complications of a divorce. Even to marry you. He's never thought about it. And you? She blushed. Neither have I. What would I have gained by it? On the contrary, I would have lost on the deal. You see, I've always had the best of him, and still have.
He does hardly anything without me. I take part in his work, I read his books as he writes them, and often I'm the one who does the research. He won't cross Paris by taxi without me at his side.
Is he afraid of dying, suddenly?
Why do you ask that? She seemed surprised at Maigrè's insight. It's been true for a few years now, pretty much ever since he discovered that he has a weak heart. At the time, he consulted several of his colleagues. You may not know this, but most doctors are more frightened by illness than their patients.
I do know that.
He's never said anything to me about it, but gradually he's got into the habit of never being on his own.
If he had an attack in a taxi, say, what could you do?
Not very much. But I understand him.
So basically, it's the thought of dying alone that frightens him.
Why exactly have you come to see me, Inspector?
Perhaps in order not to disturb your boss needlessly. His mistress was killed on Monday evening.
I don't like that word. It's inaccurate.
I use it in the meaning that's usually given to it. Physically speaking, Gouin could have committed the murder. As you yourself admitted earlier, he was alone on the 4th floor of the hospital from 9:15 until 11. There was nothing to stop him going downstairs and getting a ride to Avenue Carnot.
First of all, if you knew him, the idea would never even occur to you that he could kill someone.
On the contrary, he retorted.
He was so categorical that she looked at him with astonishment, without thinking of objecting. What do you mean?
You admit that his work, his career, his scientific research, his teaching, his medical activities, whatever, is the only thing that matters to him.
To an extent.
To a much greater extent than anyone else I've ever met. Someone used about him the words, force of nature.
This time she didn't ask who.
Forces of nature don't care about the damage they cause. If for one reason or another Lulu had become a threat to his activities...
How could she have threatened the professor's activities?
You know she was pregnant.
What difference would that have made? She didn't seem surprised.
So you knew?
The professor told me.
When?
Last Saturday.
Are you certain that he told you? On Saturday?
Absolutely. We were in the taxi coming back from the hospital. He told me, just as he tells me lots of things, without making much of it, as if he was talking to himself. I think Louise is pregnant.
How did he seem?
Fine. Quite ironic the way he usually is. You see, there are lots of things people think are important, and he doesn't.
What surprises me is that he could have talked to you about it on Saturday, when it wasn't until about 6 on Monday evening that Lulu herself found out.
You forget that he's a doctor, and that he was sleeping with her.
You think he told his wife too?
It's unlikely.
What if Louise Fillon had got it into her head to get him to marry her?
I doubt the thought ever crossed her mind, and even if it had, he wouldn't have killed her. You're barking up the wrong tree, Inspector. I'm not claiming you let the real culprit go. I don't see why that Pierrot would have killed the girl either.
Out of love, if she'd threatened not to see him again.
She shrugged. That's going a bit far.
What do you think?
I have no reason to think anything.
He stood up to empty his pipe in the fireplace, and automatically, as if he were in his own home, picked up the tongs to arrange the logs. Are you thinking about his wife? He asked in a casual tone with his back turned.
I'm not thinking about anyone.
You don't like her. How could she have liked her? Germaine Gouin was a mere nurse, a fisherman's daughter, who overnight had become the lawful wedded wife of a professor, while she, Lucille Decaux, who had devoted her life to him and was quite capable of helping him in his work, was only his assistant. Every evening when they got back from the hospital, she would get out of the taxi with him, but only to say good night in the doorway of his building and go home to her apartment in Rue des Acacias, while he went upstairs to his wife. Do you suspect her, Mademoiselle Decaux?
I never said that.
But you think it.
I think you're only too eager to pry into my boss's actions during Monday evening, but that you don't care about hers.
How do you know that?
Have you spoken to her?
I've at least learned, never mind how, that she spent the evening with her sister. Do you know Antoinette?
Not personally. The professor's told me about her.
He doesn't like her?
It's she who hates him. He told me once that whenever they happen to meet, he always expects her to spit in his face.
Do you know anything else about Madame Gouin?
Nothing, she said curtly.
Does she have a lover?
Not as far as I know, but it's none of my business anyway.
Is she the kind of woman who'd let her husband take the blame if she herself was guilty?
She said nothing.
Maigret couldn't help smiling. Admit, you wouldn't be upset if she was the one who killed Lulu, and we found out.
The one thing I know for sure is that the Professor didn't kill her.
Did he mention the murder to you?
Not on the Tuesday morning. He didn't yet know. In the afternoon, he told me casually that the police would probably be phoning to ask to see him.
And since then?
He hasn't mentioned it again.
Didn't Louise's death affect him?
If he was upset, he hasn't shown it. He's the same as usual.
I don't suppose you have anything else to tell me. Did he ever talk to you about Pierre Réau, the musician?
Never.
Did it ever occur to you that he might be jealous of him?
He's not the kind of man to be jealous of anybody.
I'm grateful to you, my dear, and I'm sorry I delayed your dinner. If you happen to remember anything interesting, don't hesitate to phone me.
Aren't you going to see my boss?
I don't know yet. Is he at home this evening?
It's his only free evening of the week.
How will he spend it?
Working, as usual. He has the proofs of his book to go through.
Maigret put on his overcoat with a sigh. You're a strange girl, he murmured as if to himself.
There's nothing remarkable about me.
Good evening.
Good evening, Monsieur Maigret.
She walked him out onto the landing and watched him go downstairs. Outside, the black car stood waiting. The driver opened the door. He almost gave him the address on Avenue Carnot. Sooner or later, he'd have to make up his mind to talk directly to Gouin. Why did he keep putting it off? He seemed to be circling around him without daring to move in closer, as if the Professor's personality overawed him. To Quai des Orfèvres. At this hour, Etienne Gouin must be in the middle of dinner with his wife. In passing, Maigret saw that there was no light in the right-hand part of the apartment. There was at least one point on which the assistant had been mistaken. Contrary to what she had asserted, Gouin's conjugal relations were less neutral than she thought. Lucille Decaux claimed that her boss didn't talk about his personal affairs with his wife, but as it happened, Madame Gouin had given Maigret details she could only have got from her husband. Had he also told her that he thought Lulu was pregnant? He had the driver stop the car a little further along the avenue, outside the bistro where he'd stopped once for a toddy. It was less cold this evening, and he ordered something else, a marc, even though it wasn't the hour for neat alcohol, simply because it was what he'd drunk the previous day. It was a habit they teased him about at Quai des Orfèvres. If he started a case with Calvados, for example, it was with Calvados that he continued. So that there were cases accompanied by beer, others by red wine. There had even been some where whiskey was the drink of choice. He was about to phone the office to ask if there was any news and have himself driven straight home. It was only because there was someone in the phone booth that he changed his mind. He didn't speak on the way. "Do you still need me?" the driver asked, once they were in the courtyard of the police judiciaire. "You can take me back to Boulevard Richelieu in a few minutes, unless you've finished your shift." "I don't finish till 8. He went upstairs and switched the light on in his office, whose second door opened immediately to admit Lucas. "Inspector Janin phoned. He's upset that nobody told him Pierre had been found." Everyone had forgotten about Janin, who had continued to search the La Chapelle neighborhood until he'd learned from the newspapers that the musician had been questioned by Maigret and released. "He's asking if he still needs to keep an eye on him." "There's no point anymore. Anything else?" Lucas was just opening his mouth when the telephone rang. Maigret picked up the receiver. "Detective Chief Inspector Maigret speaking," he said with a frown. Immediately, Lucas realized it was important. "This is Etienne Gouin," said the voice at the other end. "I'm listening." "I understand you've just questioned my assistant." Lucille Decaux had phoned her boss to let him know. "That's correct," Maigret said. "If you require information about me, it would have struck me as more proper for you to address me directly." Lucas had the impression that Maigret was losing a little of his composure and was making an effort to regain it. "That's a matter of judgment," he replied quite curtly. "You know where I live." "Yes, of course. I'll come and see you." There was silence at the other end of the line. Maigret could vaguely hear a woman's voice. It was probably Madame Gouin saying something to her husband. "When?" the Professor asked. "In an hour and a half. I haven't had dinner yet." "I'll be waiting." He hung up. "The Professor?" Lucas asked. Maigret nodded. "What does he want?" "He wants to be questioned." "Are you free?" "To go over there with you?" "Yes, but we'll have a bite to eat before that." They did so on Place Dauphine, at the table where the inspector had lunched and dined so many times that it was called Maigret's table. He didn't say a word throughout the meal.